Hey Unity audio folks. Today we're going to be going over how I prefer to think about implementation of UI sounds within Unity. We'll be starting out by using and showing off the event system within Unity. The event system is super cool for rapid prototyping. It's not always great for production code because it is a little bit inefficient, although sometimes you can get away with it for things like simple menu UI. But we'll be starting out by implementing UI sounds for an inventory system, and then for some simple menus, and towards the end, some UI sliders. So hopping over into the FMOD project we used last time, you'll see I've now broken it down into a couple folders. I'll be continuing this for project organization, but the one we'll be looking at this time is this UI scene folder. And in it, we have a UI ambience, some individual UI sounds as well. I don't think we'll end up using this hover sound this time, but using what I'm going to cover in this video, it's pretty easy to hook up hover sounds. This ambience is an asynchronous loop with two separate clips. I'm using two clips of separate lengths so that when the loop goes around on the first one, it won't be complete on the second, which will extend the lifetime of the ambience. The UI sounds are all done with action panels instead of timelines. Action panels are a newer FMOD feature, and they're nice when you have hypersimple sounds that don't need parameter controls or any sort of time manipulation. They're pretty ideal for one-shots, but there's no real performance gain for using them otherwise. So now jumping over into Unity, you'll see we have this simple kind of inventory button-based UI. We've got click events, we can drag around and drop things to kind of sort them in different orders. We also have a settings menu in the corner. This button just toggles the settings panel, and it has the sliders that we'll be using for our mixers later on. So jumping out into our scene view, we have our UI manager at the top level here, which kind of handles all of our top level controls for things like turning on and off pages. Under that, we have a canvas, which just kind of contains everything, and then individual panels for the different elements in our UI. The ones that we care about are the inventory panel here. If we open this up, it's where all of these slots are. These are just buttons that I'm using to store kind of item information in, and the various actions that are tied to those, as well as this currently disabled pause menu. If I enable it, you'll see that's where the sliders are. And then we have this toggle panel here with a button on it. That's for the settings button. And all that does is it toggles between the different enabled panels. Now, the first thing that I'll be getting into is how the event system in Unity works. So we have this onClick event here, and that's built into the button class on Unity. We won't be using that for our final version of this UI, but we will be using it to kind of test and show off how a generic UI audio script can be used. Under that, we have these event triggers, which are more specific. Things like pointer up, begin, drag, and drop. We'll be using those for like the sound when you release your pointer over a valid target, when you start dragging something as opposed to just clicking on it. The click will be the pointer up command. And then drop is when you drop something you've been dragging into one of the different inventory slots. But starting out, let's put together a generic event to use just to play any one shot that we need. All of our sounds are 2D sounds for the UI, so a one shot works fine for those. So to start, we'll go into our scripts folder and create a new script. We'll call it play generic one shot. We'll open it and get rid of all of the boilerplate code. And first, we'll need a variable that'll be exposed to the editor that'll allow people to drop their FMOD sounds into it. To start, we're going to include FMOD Unity. And often when you're starting out, you'll see people expose parameters to the editor using a public variable, something like this. Now, if I save this and go to our slot here, I'm going to open the prefab itself so that I'll be changing all of the slots at once instead of just the one that we had selected in the scene. I'll add this generic one-shot script to it, and you'll see it has a sound event right here, a string field. So with the string field, we want the string identifier for our FMOD event, but more specifically, we want the event reference string, and that's a custom FMOD type. So to enable that, we'll tag this as an event reference. And now Unity knows that this is a string that is specifically an FMOD event reference. Now, we can still type stuff in here, but we can also select specifically one of our sound events. Additionally, because we don't really need to access this variable, in fact, we probably don't want to access this variable outside of the script, we'll make it private, which will hide it from the inspector as well. But if we still want it to be private but be editable in the inspector, we can tag it with serialize field. And as you can see, the field in the inspector still exists. Now, our actual one-shot playing function is super simple. All we need to do is make a public void function. And for safety, we'll check to make sure that our string event has been set. And because it's not technically a string by Unity standards, we can check against null instead of against an empty string. That's thanks to the event reference tag. And for anything that's enacting during runtime in FMOD's audio system, we use the runtime manager. And as before, we said we wanted to play a one-shot. And you'll see we have two options. We have play one-shot and play one-shot attached. We're going to be using play one-shot because we're using 2D sounds. You can use play one-shot for 3D sounds, but they will be fixed at the location, the vector3 position that you specify when you create them. Play one-shot attached requires the object that you play it on to have a rigid body, but if it does, then the sound will travel with the object that you attach it to. And all that we need to put in the play one shot, because we don't care about where it plays, is the sound event itself. Now, back in our slot prefab, you'll see that the sound event still exists here, and all we need to do to kind of test to make sure that this works is add a field to our onClick event, and then drag the script in, and from the function selection dropdown, select our function that we just wrote, the play sound event function. Now if we save this and play, you'll notice that it's still not playing any sounds. And the reason for this is because I have this slot as a nested prefab under my UI manager. Generally, this would work as is. In our case, we're going to have to go to our sort of top level prefab, open it, and select our slots and say revert all. And that'll revert the changes that we just applied to the UI manager prefab from the slots prefab. So now they have this onClick event set. Now if I hit play and click some of the buttons here, you'll hear that they all play our test sound. However, you'll also probably recall that I said that we were not planning on using this onClick event. And the reason for that is because A, it would get kind of messy because we're going to be putting sounds in a bunch of different places if we end up using this, because we'd have to create a separate script or essentially attach a separate play generic one-shot script for every single different type of sound we want on the objects themselves. And B, it means that we would be attaching these scripts essentially like all over the place in our project. I'd rather keep all of my UI sounds, or as many of them as I can, in one location. So next I'm going to be showing how to transition into that kind of a model. And what we're going to be using for that are known as singletons. You also might have seen static class instances, and that is more specifically what we're going to be using. So first I'm going to go ahead and clean this up and remove this play generic one-shot script. And now, with everything cleaned up, we are going to create a UI audio manager script that will hold all of the UI sounds. And then from that script, we will send them out or pull them out in all of the functional locations that we need to use them. So we'll start by creating the script. Just like our other script, this one will need the FMOD Unity library. And it will also want a serialized field for each of the different UI events that we're going to be using. So in this case, we have one for drag, one for drop, one for hover, which in this case we're not going to be using, one for UI pause, one for UI unpause, and one for UI use, which is what we were just testing with. From there, we're also going to need a function for each one so that they can be called as their own individual entities. And the reason we're doing it this way, instead of passing in the actual sound instance into just one single function, so I'll write out what that would look like really quick. So the reason we're not using a function like this is because there's not really a good way of passing in a variable to a function like this, specifically using the event system. If we weren't using the event system built into Unity, then this is probably how we'd do it and just have one function that took a Unity event reference as its argument. In other words, the path to the Unity event. Now using this, we could go back into our slot here. And as you'll see, we already have functionality assigned to each of these three events. So we're just going to piggyback off of that functionality. Those are all found in this inventory slot controller script here. So for instance, our pickup event is right here. And we could create a reference to our UI audio manager script and then reference this audio manager to call each of those functions. But because we only have one UI audio manager, we're instead going to do the Singleton pattern that I mentioned earlier. And that'll mean that we don't actually need to reference this to be able to get access to those functions. So to do that, we'll go back into our UI audio manager and we'll create a public static UI audio manager. We'll call it instance. And then on awake, we'll set the instance equal to this particular instance of the UI audio manager. What this means is when the object that this script is on enters the scene, in other words, becomes awake, the public static UI audio manager field, the instance field, will be filled with this instance of that object. So if another one was to come into play, there would be some conflicts for that, and you can resolve that using don't destroy on load plus doing a check to see if there are multiple instances in the scene on load, and then just destroy the newest one. You'll usually want to destroy the newest one, not always. So with that, our UI audio manager is now a singleton, and we can access it from any of our other scripts. So to do that, we'll go over into our item, where our item's use function is, where actually we could do it in our inventory slot controller itself under use. So where this debug statement is, we'll say UI audio manager dot instance dot play UI use event. And now if I go over to our UI manager here and open it and add our audio manager, I'll need to assign all of these fields. We'll save and we'll double check that our use is assigned here, and it looks like it is, under pointer up. Now if I hit play, any of the fields that have an object in them, the sound effect will play on, and any of the ones that are empty, it won't. And the reason for that is because I'm doing this if check here against an item. So if this item here is equal to null, in other words, there's not an item in the slot, then the item won't be used, and this sound will never play. I could have also put this in the item use function itself, but for this tutorial and for organization, I'm just keeping it here. So let's go ahead and fill out the rest of them. So for set down, which is our drop sound, if there's an item and it's equal to what's in our inventory hand, we want to drop. If there's an item that's not equal to it, we also want to drop. And if there's no item, we'd still like to play the drop sound. The only time we wouldn't want to play a drop sound is conveniently also when we wouldn't want functionality, and that's when there's neither an item in our hand or an item in the slot that we're hovering over, which would be the else case here. Additionally, we'll want our drag sound if we start dragging an item. So in other words, if an item exists, then we can drag on the pickup command. And the pickup command is assigned on the begin drag event here. So now if I save and we hit play, the use sounds work, the drag start sound works, and the drag set down works. If we swap items, the set down works. And if we move our item to the end, it works as well. If we drag a blank tile onto a tile that isn't blank, the sound won't play. So that's all working as intended. Next, we're going to set up a sound for pause and unpause. So the process for that looks pretty similar. So our pause and unpause functionality, if we open up this toggle panel here and check our button, our pause button, it looks like it's being called from the UI manager. So if we open the UI manager, specifically the UI manager script, we'll see this toggle pause menu function down here. So in this toggle pause menu function, we're checking that our inventory script and our pause menu panel are not equal to null. In other words, they exist in the scene. And if they do, we are setting their enabled state to the opposite of what it currently is. This is the not symbol, and it means you're setting it to the Boolean, the true false value that it currently isn't. So if this is true, then when you put the not statement on it, this whole thing evaluates to false now, and vice versa. So what we care about is the pause menu panel specifically. So the first thing we're going to want to do is, after the toggle is complete, we're going to check to see if the pause menu is active in the hierarchy. If it is, we've just paused and we'll play the pause sound. And if it's not, we'll play the unpause sound. So here we're checking if it's active in the hierarchy. And if it is, through our UI Audio Manager Singleton, the instance of it, we are accessing the play UI pause event function. If it's not active, we'll play the unpause function. Now, because we already set up the sounds for this in the UI Manager here, this should just work. And there you have it. We have our pause and unpause sound working. And because we are disabling this inventory script here when we pause, we can no longer access any of the functionality within our inventory while paused, and so those sounds don't become a problem either. So the final thing that we want to do is hook up these volume sliders to have them actually function. And for this ambient slider in particular, I'm going to quickly go ahead and add an emitter to our scene. And this emitter will just play our ambience. Now when we hit play, we have the ambience playing underneath all of our other sounds. So to set up our volume sliders, we're going to first need to enable the pause menu so we can see what we're doing. We'll open the pause menu and click on our slider. And we have this on value change here. And what this is doing is whenever a value, it's again part of the event system, but in this case on the slider, whenever there is a value change detected on the slider, this will send a callback based on whatever functions we place in here. So in this case, we are accessing the slide manager and using our update slider output function. So we can take a look at that and you'll see update slider output. All we're doing in it right now is to the field that's next to our slider, this one here. When we move the slider, the number in that field updates. In other words, the field's text gets set to the slider's value as a string. What we want to do, additionally, is whenever this field changes, we want to change the respective mixer bus value to our slider's value as well. Now, FMOD mixer buses are already tuned to be logarithmic, so there's no real math you have to do. A value of 0 is negative infinity, a value of 1 is 0 decibels. So the first thing we're going to need to do is add a field for the path of our mixer bus. This can be generic in this case, because we'll just set it manually on each of the sliders. And we'll set it to an initial value of a blank string. That's the double quotations. And now we need a separate variable to store the bus itself, as opposed to just the path. Now on start, in other words, when this object enters the start phase, after it's been instantiated or the scene's been loaded, and also after awake has been called, that's important so that we're not conflicting things in the UI manager, we are going to use this bus path to capture the bus that we need the slider to correlate to. So first, we're going to create our function. And then we're going to check to make sure that we have set the bus path. Instead of null, this time we'll use the blank string because it is a string that is not an event reference. Again, we're going to need the FMOD Unity library for this. If we do have a path that's set, we will assign our bus through the runtime manager using the getBus function, which queries based on a string, to the string that we assign to our bus path. Ah, I've accidentally invented a second start method. That's fine, we can just copy this over. And I think we want this before the value assignments. So you'll see now we have this bus path field down here, and every bus starts with bus : / and then the name of the bus. So if I open FMOD, go to our mixer, UI group is the name of our top level bus. So that's going to be our master slider. Because this is a prefab, we can apply this to the prefab. We'll copy this. We'll then go to the sound effects slider, paste it, add the subgroup sound effects, correlating with our FMOD mixer, and we'll do the same thing for our ambience. Apply both of those to their prefabs, and now our buses should be hooked up. If I hit play and there are no errors, we know we've hooked it up properly. And we have no errors. But now we need to make our buses actually do something. So for that, once we have them assigned, the first thing we want to do is set the value of our sliders to the initial value of our mixers. So to do that, first we need to call getVolume on our bus. And getVolume outputs a variable. This shorthand here, out float volume, means we're creating a new float variable. We could also do this, and then remove float here, and that would work just fine. I prefer this syntax because it removes one line. And from here, we now set our slider value equal to the volume of our bus, but as we said, the volume of our bus is from 0 to 1, and the value of our slider might not be from 0 to 1. It might be from 0 to 3 or 0 to 10. We don't really know. So we'll offset it by the slider max value. If it doesn't start at 0, you would also subtract the minimum value from it as well, the slider.min value. And now, on update slider output, we want to do the opposite. We want to set our bus volume equal to the value of the slider, this time divided by the slider's max value. So we can use the setVolume function that's built into the bus type. And there we have it. With that, our sliders should work. Let's go ahead and hit play and test. Wait, pause. We're at 0.8. And the reason they started at 0.8 is because I forgot to remove this line. So now if I hit play, they're setting correctly to 1, which is the initial value I was intending for them to be at. And with that, we pretty much have all of the fundamentals needed to build out a UI audio system using FMOD's event system. We've got these inventory panels with multiple different sound effects hooked up to them, all running through this UI audio manager. And on top of that, we've hooked up these sliders such that if you drag them around, they will adjust the volume of each individual mixer that they're tied to. And we have a toggle button set up to enable and disable things in our scene. Cool. Hope you all enjoyed that walkthrough of some of my thought process and how I work through creating UI audio sounds and using FMOD and Unity. If you have any additional questions, I'd love to hear from you. I'd also love to hear if you enjoyed this and if it was helpful or not, and if there's anything I can work on to improve it. Please feel free to leave comments for me in the video on any of that, or reach out to me on social media. I'm active both on Twitter, on Instagram. You can find me through my website. I'll have those all posted in the video. And until next time, hope you're all having a great new year.